Useless blind girl. You think you can sit there like a queen while I do all the work? Get up and go and beg before I scatter your head. A heavy slap landed across Diana's face, sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded in her skull, but she didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears only made them hit harder. You hear me? Mama Esther's voice was thick with rage, her rough hands grabbing Diana's thin arm and yanking her up. You think I feed you for free? If you don't bring enough money today, you will sleep outside like the animal you are. Diana swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping the cold begging bowl in her trembling fingers. You should be grateful Mama even lets you stay here, Sandra's mocking voice came from the corner of the room. This was Diana's life now, a life of pain and misery. Diana sat on the hard pavement, her frail frame curled into itself as the merciless Lagos sun burned down on her bare skin. The heat was unbearable, but she had no choice. She could not see the bustling streets around her, but she could hear them, the honking of impatient Danfo drivers, the hurried footsteps of pedestrians, the occasional insults hurled at beggars like her. Her fingers curled tightly around the small metal bowl in front of her, the one she had been holding onto for years, the one that defined her entire existence. She was only 20, yet she felt like an old woman. Life had stolen her youth before she had even known what it meant to be young. Help me please, have mercy on me, she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of pleading. Some people threw a few naira notes into her bowl, some ignored her completely, and others murmured, God will help you, before walking away. But God had never helped her. She knew the moment the sun began to set, her suffering would truly begin. Diana did not beg for herself. Every morning before the city was fully awake, her stepmother, Mama Esther, dragged her out of the house, placed the begging bowl in her hands, and shoved her towards the busy market square. If you don't bring enough money home today, you won't eat. Mama Esther would snap at her, her rough hands shoving Diana out of the compound. Every evening, after enduring hunger, thirst, and the scorching sun, Diana would return home with her earnings. But she never got to keep a single kobo. Mama Esther snatched it all, counting the money greedily while her daughter, Sandra, sprawled on the couch, filing her nails and humming to herself. Only 5,000 naira today? Mama Esther would hiss. Useless blind girl. You think people will keep pitying you forever? And then the slap would come. Sharp, humiliating, making her ears ring. Diana would fall to the floor, her ribs aching from previous beatings, her stomach twisting with hunger. Meanwhile, Sandra would yawn and stretch her perfectly manicured hands, flipping her expensive weave over her shoulder. You should be grateful Mama even lets you stay here, she would sneer. Diana had long stopped crying in front of them. That evening she sat outside the small, dilapidated house, waiting for her punishment. The money she had made today was barely enough to please Mama Esther, and she knew the consequences. Her fingers traced the fresh burn on her arm, a wound from yesterday's punishment. Blind fool, you will cook today, Mama Esther had said, forcing her to kneel in front of the firewood stove. Diana had tried to be careful, but she had miscalculated the distance, and the hot pot had tipped over, burning her skin. The pain had been unbearable, but Mama Esther and Sandra had laughed. She should cook more often, Sandra had mocked. Maybe next time she'll burn her useless mouth shut too. Diana wanted to scream, to tell them she was human, that she could feel, that she could hurt, that she deserved love. But what was the point? No one would listen. That night, as she lay on the cold, hard floor, listening to the laughter of her stepmother and Sandra from inside the room they shared, her stomach growled in hunger. The hunger wasn't just physical, it was deeper. A hunger for kindness, for love, for a life beyond begging in the streets. And deep in her heart, a whisper came. One day this suffering will end. One day they will regret everything they have done to me. Sandra lived a life of luxury, at least that's what she believed. She had no job, no skills, and no sense of responsibility, but what she had was beauty. A beauty that she believed was her ticket to a life of wealth and success. While Diana sat in the sun, Sandra sat in front of the mirror, layering her face with makeup, trying on expensive wigs, and waiting for her next rich lover to call. Men are foolish, she often told her mother. Give them a pretty face and a soft body and they will throw money at you. Mama Esther encouraged it. She saw nothing wrong with Sandra's lifestyle. As long as the men gave money, as long as Sandra returned home with wads of cash, nothing else mattered. It didn't matter that Sandra spent her nights in hotels with married men. It didn't matter that she drank and partied with Yahoo boys. It didn't even matter when she returned home at dawn, barely able to walk. Mama Esther would just shake her head and say, "At least you're bringing money." Not like that useless blind girl in the corner. Sandra believed that beauty was everything. She believed that she would marry a rich man, live in a mansion and drive flashy cars. And Diana? She would marry a beggar, a drunkard, someone as miserable as her. One evening, as Sandra applied red lipstick, she turned to Diana, who was sitting quietly in a corner. "You know you'll never get married, right?" Sandra said, smirking. "Even if a man does pity you, it'll be a bus conductor or a wheelbarrow pusher. That's your level." Diana remained silent. "You should thank Mama for even keeping you in this house," Sandra continued. "If not, you'd be rotting on the streets by now." Diana clenched her fists. She wanted to tell Sandra that beauty fades, that her lifestyle would catch up with her one day. But she held her tongue. Instead, she smiled to herself and whispered the same words she had been telling herself for years. "One day everything will change. One day you will regret ever looking down on me." The afternoon was unbearably hot, the kind of heat that made the air thick and heavy, pressing down on Diana's frail body like an invisible weight. She sat at her usual spot near the market, her begging bowl in front of her, her fingers trembling from exhaustion. She had barely eaten in 2 days. Her body ached from last night's punishment. Mama Esther had been furious because she hadn't made enough money. Diana had felt every lash of the belt, every slap against her skin, but she had remained silent. Crying was useless. She whispered her usual plea, her voice barely audible. "Please have mercy on me. Help me." Most people ignored her. Others tossed in a few naira notes without a second glance. Some even muttered cruel words under their breath. "These beggars are too much in this Lagos. Why can't the government take them off the streets?" Diana had grown used to it. But today something different happened. A car pulled up beside her, the door opening. She heard the crisp sound of polished shoes hitting the pavement, followed by a deep, unfamiliar voice. "Who takes this money from you?" Diana flinched. No one had ever asked her that before. She could tell from the smoothness of his voice that he was a rich man. Rich people never spoke to beggars. "Who makes you beg on the streets?" he asked again. She didn't know why, but tears filled her eyes. Maybe it was the kindness in his tone, or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone actually cared. My stepmother," she whispered. There was silence for a moment. Then the man sighed. "How long have you been blind?" "Since birth." Another pause. Then, in a tone filled with quiet determination, he said, "Come with me." Diana's heart pounded. She had never known anything other than the streets, the beatings, the hunger. But something in his voice told her to trust him. She felt his strong, warm hand wrap around hers, guiding her gently to the car. As the engine roared to life, Diana had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Sandra paced the small living room, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. She hadn't been feeling well for weeks. At first she thought it was just a fever. Then she noticed the sores, small at first, barely noticeable. But then they spread, the skin around them turning black, the stench unbearable. Something was wrong. She had visited different hospitals, spent thousands of naira on treatments, but nothing worked. And then last night she overheard her sugar daddy talking to someone on the phone. She had been used. The realization sent a wave of nausea through her. She had laughed at Diana for years, mocked her blindness, stolen her money. But now her own body was betraying her. And her mother? Mama Esther was in shock. She wailed, begged the gods for mercy, even tried traditional herbs, but Sandra only got worse. Her beauty, her greatest weapon, was gone. She was rotting alive. That evening, as she lay on the bed, weak and shivering, she heard her mother's voice trembling with desperation. "We have to find Diana. She's our only hope now." Sandra let out a weak, bitter laugh. The same girl they had tortured, beaten, and starved was now their only savior. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. Diana had never known comfort before. The bed she lay on was soft, the air in the hospital room cool against her skin. The man who had saved her, Mr. Chikwudi, had not only taken her to a doctor but had arranged for her to undergo surgery. When the bandages were removed days later, and the world came into focus for the first time in her life, Diana could only weep. She could see. For the first time she saw the sky, the people around her, her own reflection in the mirror. She was no longer just the blind beggar. She was Diana. But her joy was short-lived. Mama Esther and Sandra came knocking. They had heard of her miracle and had come to beg, not for forgiveness but for money. Sandra's sickness had worsened. Her beauty had been stripped away, her body wasting away, her life slipping from her grasp. And now, the same mother who had once beaten Diana to the ground, the same sister who had wished her the worst, was on her knees, sobbing. "Please, Diana? You're the only one who can help." Diana clenched her fists. She wanted to turn them away, to let them suffer as she had suffered. But she couldn't. She wasn't like them. She paid for Sandra's treatment, but it was too late. The sickness had spread too far. Sandra died, her once beautiful face unrecognizable. Mama Esther wept beside her daughter's lifeless body, but it was a different kind of weeping, the kind that comes when a person realizes they have lost everything, not just their child but their soul. And Diana? She walked away into a new life. A life where she was seen. A life where she was loved. A life where she was finally free. Months later, as Diana stood on the balcony of her new home, she thought about everything she had endured. Mr. Chakwudi had not only restored her sight, he had fallen in love with her. He had proposed, offering her a life she had never even dared to dream of. And now she was no longer a beggar, no longer blind, no longer a victim. She was a survivor. And as she watched the sunset, something she had never seen before, she smiled. Because for the first time in her life, Diana knew what it meant to be happy.